Professor Gray walked into the large lecture hall of the Galactic Academy with a brisk pace. The room was filled with students from across the known universe. Beings with scales, tentacles, wings, and forms that defied simple description. As he reached the podium, he tapped the display panel and a large image of Earth appeared behind him. "This," he said, pointing to the blue-green planet, "is one of the most dangerous planets in the known galaxy." A wave of whispers spread across the room. Many students looked at each other in confusion. Earth was known, but barely. It was a newcomer to galactic society, only joining the Galactic Union 20 years ago. "I see your doubt," Gray continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Earth seems ordinary at first glance, but those who dismiss it are making a deadly mistake." In the back of the hall, Ambassador Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't planned to attend this lecture, but when he heard that his homeworld was being described as a death world, he felt he needed to see for himself. Wilson was Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Union, a position that came with many challenges. This might become another one. Professor Gray tapped his panel again, and the image changed to show Earth's weather systems: massive hurricanes, blizzards, floods, and wildfires. On most Union worlds, any one of these events would trigger an evacuation. Gray explained. "On Earth, they call it Tuesday." A few nervous laughs came from the crowd, but most remained silent, their various sensing organs fixed on the displays. Earth's gravity is crushing compared to most habitable worlds. Its atmospheric pressure would collapse the breathing systems of many species in this room. Its radiation levels from its sun would cause genetic damage to half of you within days without protection. Gray paused for effect. And yet, humans evolved there without any protective technology. A student near the front raised a limb. "Professor, this seems unlikely. How could intelligent life develop in such conditions?" "Not only did it develop," Gray replied, "it thrived because of these conditions, not despite them. Natural selection on Earth operates at a pace and intensity that most worlds never experience." Wilson smiled to himself. Gray wasn't wrong, though hearing Earth described this way was strange. He'd never thought of his home as particularly dangerous. It was just home. Gray clicked to a new image showing the human skeletal system. Humans have internal calcium-based supports, what they call bones. These structures are brittle and frequently break under stress. Most Union species evolved with more flexible support systems. Another click showed a human with various injuries. The average human will experience multiple serious injuries in their lifetime. Their medical knowledge is advanced not through curiosity but necessity. They need it to survive their world. A tall, thin student with glistening blue skin stood up. "If their world is so dangerous, how did they advance to become spacefaring?" Gray smiled, clearly pleased with the question. "That," he said, "is why Earth is truly dangerous. Not just because of its conditions, but because of what those conditions created." He gestured toward the back of the hall. "Ambassador Wilson, would you mind joining me? I believe a demonstration would be helpful." All eyes turned to Wilson, who hadn't expected to participate. Still, he stood and made his way to the front, conscious of the many eyes, sensory stalks, and other perceptive organs following his movement. "Ambassador Wilson," Gray said as Wilson reached the podium, "would you mind telling my students how many bones you've broken in your life?" Wilson thought for a moment. 3 ribs when I fell climbing as a child, my right arm playing a sport in school, and my ankle during military training." The students murmured in what seemed like horror. "And yet," Gray continued, "here you stand, completely functional." "More than functional," Wilson corrected with a smile. "I can still climb better than before. Bones heal stronger at the break point." The room fell silent as the implication sank in. "This," Gray said to his students, "is our first lesson. On Earth, what doesn't kill you truly does make you stronger, and that has made humans unlike any species we've encountered before." The next day, Professor Gray began his second lecture with a surprising announcement. Today, we will experience Earth conditions firsthand, he said, gesturing to a large sealed chamber at the side of the lecture hall. With Ambassador Wilson's help, we have created a simulation room with Earth normal conditions. The students looked at each other nervously. A reptilian student raised a scaled hand. Professor, is this safe? Completely safe, Gray assured them. The chamber has emergency protocols and can be adjusted instantly if needed. Ambassador Wilson will be inside with you. Wilson stood beside the chamber door, smiling at the anxious faces. I promise not to let anything bad happen to you. After some hesitation, 10 brave students volunteered. They followed Wilson and Professor Gray into the preparation room, where they were given basic monitoring devices. First, Gray explained, we will experience Earth's gravity and atmospheric pressure. He activated the chamber, and the volunteers felt a sudden heaviness. Several stumbled, their limbs straining under the increased weight. Wilson moved easily around the room, helping those who struggled. Earth's gravity is approximately 1.1 times greater than the Academy standard, Gray explained. Notice how Ambassador Wilson moves without effort, while many of you find it difficult. A jellyfish-like student had flattened completely against the floor, its translucent body spreading outward. Rem needs help, Wilson said, carefully lifting the gelatinous being and placing it on a special hovering platform. Adaptation 1. Gray noted, some species require technological assistance for Earth conditions. Next, Gray adjusted the temperature controls. The room became noticeably warmer, then significantly cooler, cycling through changes rapidly. Earth experiences temperature variations that would be considered extreme emergencies on many Union worlds, he explained as frost began forming on the walls. A single location on Earth might experience a 40-degree temperature swing in just one day. The students huddled together as the cold intensified. One furry student seemed comfortable, while others shivered violently. Weather patterns on Earth are chaotic and often destructive, Gray continued, as sounds of thunder played through speakers and the lighting changed to simulate storm conditions. Rain began to fall from ceiling vents. Wilson stood in the middle of the downpour, water streaming off his face. This is actually quite pleasant compared to hurricane season, he commented. A student with delicate wing membranes looked horrified. Your planet regularly experiences water falling from above. Almost every day in some regions, Wilson replied. We call it rain, and many humans find it soothing. The simulation changed again. Now bright, intense light filled the room, and the temperature rose dramatically. Solar radiation, Gray explained, is another constant threat on Earth. Their ozone layer provides some protection, but humans still experience radiation burns regularly. Several students activated personal shields. One had to leave the chamber entirely, its sensitive photoreceptors unable to handle the brightness. Most remarkable, Gray continued, is that humans not only survive these conditions, but often seek them out for pleasure. He displayed images of humans sunbathing, climbing mountains in snowstorms, and diving into powerful ocean waves. The students stared in disbelief. Ambassador Wilson, Gray asked, what do humans call these activities? Fun, Wilson replied with a grin, or sometimes vacation. After an hour of various Earth simulations, the students exited the chamber. They looked exhausted but fascinated. The conditions you just experienced, Gray told them, represent just a small fraction of Earth's environmental extremes, and we kept everything well within safe parameters for your species. One student, a tall being with metallic skin that had dulled during the exercise, raised a hand. Professor, if these conditions are normal on Earth, why do humans even leave their planet? Is not the rest of the galaxy too boring for them? Wilson answered before Gray could speak. We're explorers by nature. Earth taught us to adapt, so we're curious what else we can adapt to. He smiled. Besides, we find your worlds fascinating, not boring. Different doesn't mean less interesting. Gray nodded approvingly. And that, students, is why humans are such valuable members of the Galactic Union. They don't just survive challenges, they actively seek them out and learn from them. As the students filed out, many looked at Wilson with new respect in their eyes, and perhaps a touch of fear. For the third lecture, Professor Gray had prepared something special. The classroom was arranged differently, with tables set up in a circle. On each table sat sealed transparent containers of various shapes and sizes. Today, Gray announced, we examine Earth's biological arsenal. Ambassador Wilson stood nearby, helping Gray arrange the final displays. He looked slightly amused at the dramatic presentation. Earth contains more than 10 million known species, Gray began. Many of them can kill or seriously harm humans, and would be even more dangerous to non-Earth life forms. Gray activated the main display, showing microscopic organisms in intense detail. These are bacteria and viruses native to Earth. Humans live with trillions of these organisms in and on their bodies at all times. A collective shudder passed through the classroom. Most union species have evolved in environments with fewer than 100 potentially harmful microorganisms, Gray explained. Humans have evolved alongside millions. A student with smooth green skin raised a tentacle. How do they survive? Excellent question, Gray replied. Humans have developed an internal defense system of remarkable complexity. He displayed a diagram of the human immune system. Their bodies wage constant warfare against invaders, without the humans even being aware of it. Wilson stepped forward. May I add something, Professor? Gray nodded. Most humans get several minor illnesses every year, Wilson explained. We call them colds or flu, and generally continue our daily activities while infected. The students looked horrified. You function while hosting active pathogens, asked a crystal-structured being. Of course, Wilson replied. If we stopped for every infection, we'd never get anything done. Gray moved to the first container. This is just water from an earth pond. He magnified the image to show the teeming microscopic life. There are more organisms in this small sample than on some entire Union worlds. Moving to the next table, Gray carefully lifted a sealed box. Inside was what appeared to be a small plant with delicate leaves. This harmless-looking specimen is called poison ivy. Simply touching it causes most humans painful blistering skin reactions. And this plant is common? Asked a student. Very, Wilson replied. Many human children learn about it the hard way. Gray continued around the circle, showing increasingly concerning Earth life forms. A preserved jellyfish, images of venomous snakes, bacterial cultures, fungal samples, and finally, a sealed container with a simple spider inside. This small arachnid, Gray said, contains enough neurotoxin to kill several humans. Yet it's one of thousands of venomous species humans coexist with daily. A student toward the back spoke up. Professor, if Earth is so filled with dangerous life forms, how have humans avoided extinction? They've done more than avoid extinction, Gray replied. They've thrived precisely because of these dangers. Gray displayed a timeline of human evolution. Each threat pushed humans to develop new defenses, technologies, or adaptations. Their medical science advanced rapidly out of necessity. Wilson nodded. My species went from discovering antibiotics to mapping our entire genome in less than a century. Necessity drove innovation. But most remarkable, Gray continued, is what happened to humans psychologically. He showed brain scans of humans responding to threats. Humans developed pattern recognition and threat assessment capabilities far beyond most species. They can sense danger in ways that seem almost like magic to other life forms. At that moment, the lights in the classroom flickered and dimmed unexpectedly. In the sudden semi-darkness, Wilson immediately tensed and moved to a defensive position, scanning the room. The reaction was so quick that most students barely saw him move. When the lights returned to normal seconds later, Wilson looked slightly embarrassed as he relaxed his stance. That, Gray said, is what I was just describing. Ambassador Wilson's threat response activated before his conscious mind could process what was happening. Most Union species would simply wait to determine if a threat existed. I apologize, Wilson said with a small smile. Old habits. No need for apologies, Gray replied. You've just provided the perfect demonstration of today's lesson. Humans don't just survive in dangerous environments. They are fundamentally shaped by them, down to their very instincts. As the class ended, the students gave the sealed specimens a wide berth. They looked at Wilson with new understanding, and perhaps a hint of caution. For his fourth lecture, Professor Gray took a different approach. Instead of remaining in the classroom, he arranged for the students to meet at the Academy's main dining hall. Today we discuss human adaptability through one of their most impressive achievements, their diet, Gray announced as the students gathered around a long table filled with covered dishes. Wilson stood nearby, looking both amused and slightly concerned. He had helped prepare this demonstration, but wondered if the students were ready for it. Most species in the Galactic Union consume between 5 and 20 different food sources, Gray explained. Humans regularly consume thousands. He lifted the cover from the first dish, revealing a colorful array of fruits and vegetables. These are plant materials that humans eat raw. Some contain mild toxins that humans have adapted to not only tolerate but enjoy. A student with blue, scaled skin leaned forward. Toxins. They eat poisons intentionally. Exactly, Gray replied. Take this fruit called chili pepper. It contains capsaicin, a chemical that causes burning pain sensations. He held up a small red pepper. Some humans compete to eat the most painful varieties. Wilson smiled. We call it spicy food. Many of us seek it out specifically for the burning sensation. The students exchanged looks of disbelief. Gray moved to the next dish. Here we have honey, a substance made by small flying insects on Earth. Humans steal it from the insects, who defend it with painful stinging attacks. And this, he continued, unveiling another plate, is cheese, essentially spoiled mammal milk colonized by specific fungi. A collective sound of disgust rippled through the gathered students. Wilson picked up a piece of cheese and ate it casually. Delicious. This variety has been aged for 3 years. You intentionally eat aged, spoiled secretions, a plant-like student asked, their leaves curling slightly. With pleasure, Wilson replied. We have thousands of varieties. Some are considered delicacies. Gray moved along the table, revealing more earth foods, fermented beverages, preserved meats, pickled vegetables, and items containing various sweeteners, preservatives, and flavor enhancers. What's most remarkable, Gray explained, is that humans can dramatically change their diet when needed. They can survive on almost anything with nutritional value. He displayed images of humans living in extreme environments, deserts where they consumed only sparse plants and water, Arctic regions where they ate primarily animal fat and protein, and jungle areas where they gathered unfamiliar plants and insects. When humans first joined the Galactic Union, Gray noted they were the only species that could safely eat food on over 60% of member worlds without special processing. Their digestive adaptability is unmatched. Wilson nodded. During my first diplomatic mission, there was a life support failure on the transport ship. While the other delegates had to be put in stasis, I simply ate the emergency rations meant for 3 different species until rescue arrived. This adaptability extends beyond just food, Gray continued. Humans can learn to live in almost any environment if given time to adjust. He activated a large display showing humans living underwater in habitats, surviving in space stations, working in toxic industrial environments, and thriving in both freezing and scorching climates. At the Academy, we maintain living quarters within a narrow range of conditions for most species, Gray explained. For humans, we simply provide basic shelter, and they adapt to whatever conditions exist. One student raised a limb. Is it true that humans can even adapt to toxic atmospheres? Within limits, Wilson answered. We can't breathe vacuum or methane, but our lungs can adjust to surprising amounts of particulate matter and various gas concentrations. Cities on Earth often have air quality that would be considered hazardous on most Union worlds. Humans even sleep through conditions that would trigger emergency alarms for other species. Gray added, loud noises, temperature changes, or minor atmospheric shifts barely register to them. Wilson suppressed a yawn. Sorry, I was up late helping prepare these demonstrations. Another human adaptation. We can function with surprisingly little sleep when needed. The students looked at the remaining covered dishes with newfound caution. For your optional assignment, Gray said with a slight smile, you may try these Earth foods. Ambassador Wilson has assured me they're safe for all your species, though the experience may be memorable. As Gray had predicted, only a few brave students approached the table. Those who did looked at Wilson with a mix of respect and astonishment as he casually consumed items that made some of them recoil just from the smell alone. Impossible, said one faculty member. She must have seen it before. I assure you she has not, Gray replied. This is simply how humans approach problems, particularly under pressure. Captain Reed shrugged. It wasn't particularly difficult. Earth's natural world presents far more complex challenges daily. Gray displayed brain scans of various species. Most Union species have specialized neural pathways for specific problems. Humans have remarkable neural plasticity. Their brains constantly rewire themselves to solve new challenges. Ambassador Wilson stepped forward. Our history is filled with examples of this. When faced with problems that seemed impossible, humans often found solutions simply because they didn't know a solution was impossible. This is why Earth's danger created such a unique species. Gray continued, humans don't just survive danger. They learn from it, adapt to it, and ultimately use it. A tall insectoid faculty member raised a limb. This doesn't explain human aggression. Your species has a troubling history of violence. Captain Reed nodded. We do. We're predators at our core. But that same aggressive drive that once made us hunt is what now pushes us to explore, to solve problems, to protect others. And that, Gray added, is why humans are both valued and feared in the Galactic Union. Their minds are weapons forged in Earth's dangers. To demonstrate further, Gray set up an emergency simulation. The room's lights suddenly dimmed, and alarm sounds began blaring. A holographic display showed a critical engine failure on a spacecraft. Standard response time to begin addressing this scenario is 42 seconds among Union species, Gray noted. Captain Reed was already moving before Gray finished speaking. She assessed the system failures, prioritized critical functions, and began implementing a solution. Her hands moved through the holographic controls with practiced precision. Rerouting power from non-essential systems, she said calmly despite the blaring alarms. Initiating backup cooling protocols. Sequencing emergency restart. The simulation showed the crisis coming under control. 28 seconds, Gray announced. And that's without any familiarity with our specific systems. The room fell silent as the alarm ceased. This is what Earth created, Gray said quietly. A species that doesn't freeze in danger but accelerates. Thinking faster, more creatively. Finding solutions where others see only problems. Wilson added, it's why we call Earth a crucible, not just a dangerous planet. It forged us, shaped us into what we are. As the students left, many looked at the two humans with newfound understanding. What they had first seen as a primitive species from a backwater world now appeared in a different light, as creatures shaped by fire, ready to face whatever the universe might throw at them. The sixth session of Professor Gray's lecture series never happened, at least not in the classroom. Early that morning, emergency alarms sounded throughout the academy. A group of students and faculty members at a remote research outpost had sent a distress signal before communications suddenly cut off. The station monitored a rare stellar phenomenon near the border of Union space. Professor Gray and Ambassador Wilson were in a meeting with Academy officials when the news arrived. The outpost is under attack, the Academy director announced grimly. An unknown vessel appeared without warning. We've dispatched security forces, but they won't arrive for at least 6 hours. Wilson leaned forward. Which outpost? Who's stationed there? When told the location, his face darkened. 3 of your students are there, Professor. They left for an observation project last week. Gray looked concerned. What are we doing to help them? Standard protocol is to wait for proper security forces, the director replied. We don't engage unknown hostiles without appropriate preparation. Wilson stood suddenly. I have a small diplomatic shuttle in the Academy Bay. It's fast and has basic defense systems. You can't seriously be suggesting, the director began. I am. Wilson interrupted. Those students don't have 6 hours. Captain Reed, who had been invited to the meeting to discuss future demonstrations, nodded. I'll go with him. My security clearance should authorize emergency weapons access. The director looked horrified. This is against all Union protocols. We don't send civilians. With respect, Wilson said firmly, Earth protocols are different. We don't leave people behind. Within 20 minutes, Wilson and Reed were aboard the small diplomatic shuttle, racing toward the outpost. The director had reluctantly authorized their departure after Wilson insisted it was an Earth diplomatic initiative, outside standard Union jurisdiction. This is foolish, the Academy's security chief had warned. 2 humans against an unknown hostile force. What do you hope to accomplish? We'll improvise, Captain Reed had replied simply. As they approached the outpost 3 hours later, they could see the situation was dire. A sleek, predatory-looking ship hovered near the small research station. Parts of the outpost appeared damaged, and no communications were coming from inside. Scan shows 12 life forms aboard the station, Reed reported. Our students and the regular staff, plus, she frowned, 3 unknown biosignatures, heavily armed from the energy readings. Wilson piloted the shuttle to the far side of the outpost, away from the hostile ship. We can dock at the emergency airlock. They probably won't expect anyone to be crazy enough to board during an active attack, which is exactly why it will work, Reed agreed, checking her small sidearm. I don't suppose this diplomatic vessel has anything more substantial for weapons. Wilson pressed a hidden panel, revealing a compartment containing what looked like simple metal rods. Emergency defense kit. Not powerful, but better than nothing. They docked silently at the emergency airlock. The outpost's backup systems still functioned enough to allow them entry without alerting the attackers. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Equipment lay broken, and signs of struggle were everywhere. They moved quietly through the shadowed corridors, following Reed's scanner toward the life signs. They found the first body near the main lab, one of the outpost's regular staff. Wilson checked for signs of life, but shook his head grimly. These aren't just raiders, Reed whispered, examining the precision of the attack. Military tactics. They heard voices ahead, harsh, commanding tones in an unfamiliar language. Peering around a corner, they saw 3 tall, heavily armored figures. They had gathered the surviving staff and students in the main observatory room. One student, a fragile crystalline being from Gray's class, lay injured. The others, including the 2 remaining student researchers, were being forced to download the outpost's research data. Pirates would just take what they want and leave, Wilson whispered. They're after specific research. Reed nodded. Military intelligence operation. They're going to eliminate witnesses once they have what they want. Wilson examined the room's layout, noting the positions of attackers, hostages, and equipment. We need a distraction. Reed pointed to the environmental controls. Humans can handle extreme conditions better than most species. Wilson smiled as he understood. And better than our friends in the heavy armor. With quick hand signals, they formed a plan. Reed slipped away toward the environmental systems, while Wilson positioned himself near the entrance, ready to move. Minutes later, the room's temperature plummeted and the lights went out simultaneously. The attackers shouted in confusion. In the chaos, Wilson and Reed made their move. What followed would later be described in hushed tones by the rescued students. How two humans moved with precision in total darkness and freezing cold. How they used the attackers' heavy armor against them. How Wilson and Reed fought not with superior weapons, but with speed, adaptability, and a strange, frightening intensity. By the time emergency lights activated, 3 armored attackers lay subdued. The hostages were safe, and Wilson was already at the communications array, calling for medical evacuation. The Great Hall of the Galactic Union had never been so quiet. Every seat was filled, yet the normal murmur of hundreds of delegates was absent. All eyes focused on the central speaking platform, where Professor Gray stood beside Ambassador Wilson and Captain Reed. Behind them, the rescued students from the research outpost sat in places of honor. The crystalline student who had been injured now sparkled with health again, though a visible line marked where the damage had been repaired. The academy director, looking both impressed and slightly uncomfortable, introduced Professor Gray to deliver what was now being called the Earth Lecture. Gray stepped forward, his academic robes replaced by a more formal outfit for this historic occasion. Esteemed delegates, he began, 1 week ago, I was teaching a class about why Earth is one of the most dangerous planets in our known galaxy. Today, I stand before you to conclude that lesson, not in a classroom, but in the heart of our Union. He gestured toward Wilson and Reed. What I taught in theory, these humans demonstrated in practice. When our students were in danger, standard Union protocol dictated waiting for proper security forces. These humans chose a different path. Gray displayed images from the outpost's security recordings, Wilson and Reed moving through darkness, fighting with improvised weapons, protecting the wounded with their own bodies. The attackers have since been identified as members of a previously unknown hostile group seeking advanced technology. They expected to encounter beings who would surrender when faced with superior weaponry and threat of harm. Instead, they encountered humans. A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. Throughout my lecture series, I explained how Earth's dangers shaped human evolution, how extreme weather, biological threats, and constant challenges created a species unlike any other in our Union. But abstract knowledge is not understanding. Wilson stepped forward. I'm not a soldier, he said simply. Before becoming an ambassador, I was a teacher. Captain Reed is a trained security officer, but at that moment, we were just 2 humans doing what humans do, adapting to a threat and protecting others. Reed nodded. We didn't consider ourselves heroes. On Earth, such actions are expected. Our planet taught us that survival often depends on immediate action, not waiting for ideal conditions. Gray continued, the Union has always valued stability, predictability, and careful planning. These are virtues for species that evolved in relatively stable environments. But our galaxy is not always stable or predictable. He displayed a map of recent border conflicts and natural disasters across Union space. In the past decade, unexpected threats have increased by 47%. Our traditional approaches are proving insufficient. The Academy director stepped forward. Based on this incident and Professor Gray's research, I propose that we formally recognize Earth's special status within the Union, not just as a member world, but as a source of unique problem-solving approaches and defensive capabilities. Wilson looked surprised at this suggestion. Furthermore, the director continued, I recommend we establish an exchange program allowing humans to serve on Union vessels and outposts, while Union members train on Earth to better understand the human approach to challenges. The Union Council leader, a tall being with luminescent features, rose from her central position. Ambassador Wilson, would Earth accept such responsibility? To share not just your technology, but your perspective. Wilson looked at Reed, then back at the council leader. Earth doesn't consider itself special or exceptional. We're simply the product of our world. But if our experiences can help the Union, we're willing to share them. The greatest lesson Earth teaches, Gray added, is not about physical toughness or combat skills. It's about seeing problems as challenges rather than obstacles. about refusing to accept that something is impossible simply because it hasn't been done before. The crystalline student who had been rescued stood up. Its voice resonated through the hall. Before the attack, I thought humans were primitive and unnecessarily aggressive. When danger came, I understood. They don't seek violence, but they don't fear it either. They move toward problems while others retreat. The council voted unanimously to adopt the proposed measures. As the session ended, delegates surrounded Wilson and Reed, each wanting to speak with the humans who had demonstrated such extraordinary actions. Gray watched from a distance, smiling slightly. To him, the most interesting lesson wasn't about Earth's dangers at all, but about how those dangers had created a species that saw helping others not as heroism, but as simple necessity. Wilson caught his eye across the crowd and nodded slightly. No words were needed. The true lesson of Earth had been learned, not from lectures or demonstrations, but from actions when they mattered most.